about something that happened about 10 years after we recorded that episode. I was being interviewed by an English journalist, and for the very first time I let slip the identity of Gleneagles Hotel and Mr. Sinclair. And within days, the Daily Mail had tracked the poor man down to his retirement home in Florida, and he refused to speak to them. But they showed his daughter, who had never seen the programs, a couple of the shows, and when she watched them, she turned to the journalist and said, "That's Dad." For me, the thing I like best about Fawlty Towers is that people could enjoy it because it's just about ordinary human behaviour, and kids can follow it too. It's just about frustration and anger and disappointment and trying to cover things up, things like that. The only problem is that the kids always identify with Manuel. But it was a completely different story with dear old Monty Python, because a lot of people just didn't get it at all, including my mother and many BBC executives, because it wasn't about ordinary human behaviour, it was about silly ideas, and it caused a lot of people complete bewilderment. Journalists used to ask us, well, what do you call this kind of comedy? And it sort of annoyed us. We said, well, we're not calling it anything, we're just doing it. We're just trying to make each other laugh. We never talked about what we thought we were doing or any theory. And yet all the best comedians now, from the great Steve Martin down, all say that Python was seminal and changed the way they thought about comedy and influenced them and all that stuff. So it's quite interesting, I hope, to tell you how it started, because Graham Chapman and I were writing films for Peter Sellers. I hope you're impressed, because he was a huge star at that time. He just made the first Pink Panther, just become Inspector Clouseau. But although we worked 5 days a week writing films for him, on the Thursday we used to stop work early in order to switch on the television at 5 o'clock and watch children's television. So why are two 30-year-olds watching kids' programs? Because the program happened to be the funniest thing on BBC television at that time, morning, noon or night, because it had Michael Palin, it had Eric Idle, it had Terry Johnson, it had the beginnings of Terry Gilliam's animations. And we knew them a little bit, and after a particularly funny episode, I said to Graham, why don't we call these guys and see if they want to do a show with us? And they said, yes, that sounds like fun. So we got our friend Marty Feldman, you remember Marty, to arrange a meeting for us with the great god of BBC television comedy. It was a fellow called Michael Mills, who was the head of BBC Life Entertainment. And we went into his office and he greeted us. We knew each other a little bit, and I sat down and he said, I understand you guys want to do a television series. And we said, well, we'd love to. And he said, well, what do you have in mind? And there was a bit of a pause because we hadn't actually discussed it. And if that seems extraordinary, you're beginning to understand Monty Python. We were a very strange lot, but we tried to improvise. We said, well, you know, we want to do a comedy program with humorous material intended to make people laugh, with jokes and gags and generally things that will amuse people as much as... He said, well, are you going to have guest stars? And we said, are we going to have good? He said, well, what about music? We said, music? We haven't really talked about music. We said, we're going to use film. He said, film. We said, that's a great idea. Yes, we'll certainly use some film. And I remember thinking, we are making complete fools of ourselves in front of the most important person in our profession. And he looked at us and shrugged and said, oh, go away and make 13 programs. Isn't that extraordinary? That's exactly what happened. And when I was writing my autobiography 2 years ago, I thought to myself, that has never happened in the history of television. That a guy has green-lighted an entire series when he had no idea what the group was going to do, and when we had no idea what we were going to do. So we sat down and had meetings and got absolutely nowhere, and then somebody said, let's just go home and write, and we just started to write, and it kind of happened like that. People always ask Python, well, where did you get your ideas from? And, well, I can say this because I lecture on creativity. It's always fascinated me, but anything really fresh and new always comes from the unconscious, so you can't afterwards describe how it happened, because he wasn't conscious. But the crucial thing about Python was that we had total freedom. The shows went out very late at night, for a tiny audience, and so none of the BBC executives bothered to watch. So without any supervising, we had this tremendous sense of liberation, and we responded by just being very, very silly. Instead of having a sketch about a politician or a general or a bishop, you know, we would interview a heron or a pool of linseed oil or a matchbox, you know. I remember on one occasion when Graham Chapman was actually playing the part of a politician, he was